Senator Gravel, when did you first start hearing in D.C. about land claims, and who did you start hearing it from?
First off, I want to reinforce what Jack Raddick was saying, is that the visibility towards the claims was really not around. And you have to really realize that when I was campaigning in the area, this is not a subject that was brought up. This is not a quid pro quo. We'll vote for you to support native land claims. It was not a subject we discussed, and which communicates the fact that even within the native community, it was not that big an issue. What made it, the beginning of it, and we should give really recognition to Fred Paul and his father, William Paul, I believe. These were two attorneys in Seattle that really pushed it and set the legal stage for what went on. And so when you look to the Caucasian community, the urban area, this wasn't an issue. It wasn't even known. And from what I can decipher, it wasn't known really within the Native Corporation. It was as a result of this political recognition that here was a group of people, a power, a political power, a constituency power that was just coming alive. The key on the Native side was the formation of the AFN. This now provided a centralized clearinghouse where these disparate groups could come together and argue, discuss, and coalesce. Without the coalescing, you'd have never seen anything happen. And that was the potential tragedy of it, because as you know, the issue with the Pauls went to the Supreme Court, and they did not grant certiorari. They didn't want to deal with it. And so that began to set the stage, and then with this political awareness, then the coalescing, I became very sensitive to the land claims right after I got elected. Both Ted and I, this was it. This was going to be the biggest issue we had in front of us from the get-go. And that was as a result of 66, the coalescing, the leadership, and you can just tick off the names that we all know that were active, and they were there, coming to Washington. And they were having difficulty raising money. And of course, it was the Tyonics that got this oil money and used their money to undergird the AFN. Probably the most significant event, probably two of them. One was the coalescing of the Native community itself into a political force, into a cultural force to demand change. And if you've ever heard me talk, they demanded change. You stop stealing my land. You know, it was very blunt and very straightforward. But the other was the uniqueness, and I say this because I battled with this person extensively, and that was Scoop Jackson. Scoop Jackson really and I were not friends. From Washington, who had a hand in bringing about statehood. And as a result of that, he and Magnuson were lionized in Alaska, which was at the time politically controlled by the Democrats. And so it was a natural. Now, Scoop Jackson had a demeanor that lent itself to a leadership role that no other person in the Congress had. First off, it was in his committee. He was a patient person. Regardless of what went on, we're just going to keep moving ahead very slowly. And he had competent advice with an attorney, Bill Van Ness. And so I view the success of that, the natives themselves, because the rest of us were on the chessboard playing our roles, and some of us played them pretty well. But it was those two elements, a leader in the Congress who could meld together the power of the Congress to whatever was arrived at in subcommittee was going to pass into law. But nothing was arrived at in subcommittee of the committee unless it was acceptable in a coalescing, in a unanimous kind, but it was consensus. More, it wasn't unanimous, it was consensus. And that consensus was transferred to the Congress, which Jackson utilized to get the legislation through, and Ted and I were obviously in baggage at the time. We're obviously wheel horses just doing that. We had our differences, but that's how it came about. We could go into the details, and there's several areas that I'm proud of, but let's see what the chairman here wants to guide us into.
I also wanted to ask Tim to talk a little bit about the scenario in Alaska at the time. We're talking about the 60s. This is an issue that not too many people know about, as you've heard. But at the same time, most of the communities were very remote. There was very little communication, and people had a hard time communicating.
Well, that's right. The the only media in the state were the major urban newspapers. They paid sporadic attention to rural issues and native issues, and it was interestingly the formation of the Tundra Times, the early beginnings of the rural awareness of political power, the formation of the Tundra Times in Fairbanks, which I had the privilege of working on for a brief period in 1966, but led to a sense of voice for rural people and rural issues that had been absent before. And I think there was also a certain amount of pride that led to, that people in the communities realized that their issues were being written about, and they could see them in newspapers, and they felt that they had some representation in the broader communities. And also, significantly, politicians began to pay attention to it because of the Tundra Times. Howard Rock was the publisher of the Tundra Times. The Symbolic became very influential in breaking many important news stories of things that the mainstream media had ignored. The radiation problems of the North Slope, for example, Rampart Dam issues of the Yukon River, many issues, the relationship between Aleut people and the Fish and Wildlife, or the NOAA, whoever ran the Pribilof Islands, the federal agency. It was almost a situation of slavery for those people. National Marine Fisheries, and it was very little known in the mainstream political community until the Tundra Times broke the story, and then eventually the mainstream media began picking it up. But the politicians read the Tundra Times. It didn't have much of a circulation in terms of numbers, but it was the people who read it that made it significant. Governor Regan, many of the legislators paid a lot of attention to it. So it was that kind of a sense of voice that began to be important. And of course, about that time, the Claims Act was beginning to develop into a movement. The AFN was forming, so the thing kind of took off from there. But the rural, as Nellie said, the rural communities were scattered far and wide, very little communication. People didn't know in one region what was happening in another region. So the Tundra Times, it wasn't perfect, but it helped. And it was the first one of its kind.
It was interesting because Senator Gravel was talking about the telephone booth, but most of the villages didn't have telephones. They might have one radio phone that was for emergency purposes, but for the most part, it was difficult to communicate.
Yeah. Now, I recall the impact of the Tundra Times, and that was the main form of communication, but there was also another communication system in place, which we kind of tongue-in-cheek called the Mukluk telegraph, and it was amazing, and it still exists today, by the way, because as mayor, my mother seems to have a knack for knowing about things that happened in one of our villages before I do. But there was a communication system between the communities up there that still, I don't understand how they did it, but from one end by Canada to Point Hope, information started spreading out, and again, the impacts that I had, that Tundra Times had when I was in the military, off in Vietnam, and the Tundra Times was where I think I got the bulk of where everything was going on. So again, I think that for communications was a big impact, because mail thankfully still came in, but that's about where at least my uncle got a lot of his information too on what was going on.
And forget television. No television.
No television. You had, by the time I got back to Barrow, telephones had just come online, but you had a party line of about 30 people.
The whole town.
So I still recall even in, when I got, after the Prudhoe Bay event, going to Point Hope, when the village was just being moved, you had to walk clear to the other end of town, and this was in the mid-'80s, clear to the other end of town to a satellite station, one phone, and that was it. And that was right at mid-'80s, so communications was definitely a challenge. And what the senator says about the formation, creation of AFN was another key point where communications was shared.